Sir, this damage pattern doesn't match what we typically see from storm activity. I'm going to need to flag this claim for fraud review." The adjuster said it loudly enough that two people waiting in the small lobby looked up from their phones. Nathaniel Cole sat across the desk from her at Meridian Home Insurance with his 10-year-old son, Owen, beside him, having brought photographs of the roof damage from the previous week's storm, a contractor's repair estimate, and the claims paperwork he had filled out carefully the night before. He wore his work jacket, still dusty from helping the contractor with a preliminary tarp job that morning, and none of it seemed to matter. From the moment the adjuster, a woman named Priya Nandan, looked at his clothes, flipped through his photographs with visible skepticism, and decided, before examining the actual damage evidence closely, exactly what kind of claimant she was dealing with. Owen, sensing something shift in the air, even before he looked up from his book, glanced toward his father with the same quiet watchfulness he brought to most unfamiliar situations. "I've seen a lot of claims dressed up to look like storm damage," Priya said, sliding the photographs back across the desk. "I'm going to need to send an independent inspector before I can process anything." What happened over the next 20 minutes would end with Priya sitting behind her own desk with no explanation left to give. Another claimant in the waiting room recognizing Nathaniel's face from a medevac flight that had saved his brother's life overseas, and everyone within earshot learning exactly who they had just watched get accused of insurance fraud over storm damage to his own roof. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there's more coming. Nathaniel Cole had spent 12 years as an Air Force pilot, the last 7 of those flying combat search and rescue helicopters into contested areas to retrieve wounded personnel under conditions that offered little margin for hesitation or error, before transitioning 3 years ago into a civilian career flying medical transport helicopters for a regional hospital network, work that let him use his flying skills without the deployments that had once kept him away from home for months at a time. He had raised Owen largely alone since his wife's death from cancer 2 years earlier, an absence that had reshaped nearly everything about how Nathaniel approached the ordinary, unglamorous work of getting through each day. And he had made the transition to civilian flying, specifically because he needed a schedule that let him be present for his son, who had already lost one parent, and could not afford, in Nathaniel's estimation, to lose the sense of stability the other one provided. He was 40, tall and precise in his movements, with a calm, measured way of speaking that came from years of talking through crisis situations over radio channels where panic in his voice could cost lives on the ground. He had entered flight training after 4 years as a regular Air Force officer, drawn to the specialized rescue program by both genuine aptitude for flying and a deep motivation to be directly useful in the moments that mattered most, rather than removed from them by layers of process. The training had been some of the most demanding work he had ever undertaken, combining advanced flight skills with medical training and the specific psychological composure required to fly into hostile areas under fire. A combination that washed out the majority of his original class through sheer accumulated difficulty. The physical and mental toll of the program had been considerable, testing not just piloting skill, but the specific capacity to make split-second tactical decisions while simultaneously managing the medical needs of critically wounded passengers, a combination few candidates could sustain through the full length of training. He had loved the work that followed, with an intensity he rarely tried to explain to people outside that world. The particular clarity that came from a job where every mission carried immediate, tangible stakes, and where his specific skills were often the only thing standing between a wounded person and a fatal outcome He worked now as a medical transport pilot, flying patients between hospitals and accident scenes across a wide regional service area, a job that used the core of his actual training while letting him sleep in his own bed most nights, a trade he had made without hesitation once Owen needed him present in a way that had never been quite as urgent before his mother's death. A decision he had never once regretted, despite what it cost him professionally. His colleagues at the hospital network knew he had served but little beyond the basic fact of it, a gap in shared knowledge Nathaniel had never felt any particular need to close. He did not talk about the specifics of his military years unless directly asked, partly because the details did not translate easily into casual conversation, and partly because he had learned that most people's curiosity about his service rarely extended past a surface-level fascination that did not require him to relive anything genuinely difficult in the answering. He kept his old flight logs and a handful of photographs from his years of service in a box in the closet, rarely examined but never discarded, alongside mementos from a chapter of his life that felt, most days, like it belonged to a considerably different person. He had a particular photograph, taken shortly before Owen was born, of his entire rescue squadron standing in front of their aircraft after a difficult deployment, all of them exhausted and grinning in the specific way of people who had survived something genuinely dangerous together and understood, without needing to say so, exactly what that shared experience had cost each of them. Their house carried the particular quiet order of a household run by a man determined to give his son as much stability as he could manage on his own. A wall calendar in the kitchen tracking Owen's school schedule, alongside Nathaniel's flight rotations. A small shelf in Owen's room, holding a photograph of his mother that Nathaniel made a point of discussing honestly whenever Owen asked about her. He coached Owen's youth football team in the fall, mostly because nobody else had volunteered, and Owen had asked with an earnestness impossible to refuse, and the previous week's severe storm had torn a significant section of shingles from their roof, forcing Nathaniel into an insurance claims process he had never needed to navigate before, since this was the first significant damage claim he had ever filed on the house. Owen was a quiet, observant child in the way of kids raised largely by a father who modeled careful attention as the default response to most situations, and he had come along to the insurance office mostly because it was a teacher planning day at school, and there was nowhere else for him to be. He had brought a book to occupy himself during what he expected to be a boring but straightforward errand, settling into the chair beside his father with the patient resignation of a child accustomed to occasionally tagging along for adult tasks that held no interest for him whatsoever, at least until the tone of the conversation at the desk shifted into something he could sense, even without fully understanding. He had grown accustomed, over the past 2 years, to reading the subtle shifts in his father's demeanor that signaled when something was actually wrong versus merely inconvenient, a skill most children his age had not yet needed to develop. They had been called back to Priya Nandan's desk after a short wait, Nathaniel laying out his documentation in the organized, methodical way he approached most administrative tasks. The contractor's estimate, dated photographs of the damage taken the morning after the storm, and the completed claims form he had filled out carefully the night before, double-checking every field against the insurer's own published requirements to make sure nothing was missing. Priya reviewed the materials with an attention that seemed, at first, entirely routine, until she reached the photographs, and something in her posture shifted. A recalibration Nathaniel recognized immediately, because he had encountered similar moments in contexts that had nothing to do with insurance paperwork. Moments where the specific fact of a person's appearance seemed to override every other piece of information available in the room. "I've seen a lot of claims dressed up to look like storm damage," Priya said, sliding the photographs back across the desk. "I'm going to need to send an independent inspector before I can process anything." Nathaniel, genuinely confused, given that the storm had been extensively documented by local news and that his neighbors had filed similar claims for the same damage, asked. What specifically about his photographs suggested they had been staged or misrepresented? Priya's expression did not soften. The pattern just looks inconsistent with typical wind damage, she said, a justification that had nothing to do with the actual documented evidence, and everything to do with an assumption she had formed about Nathaniel personally, rather than about the photographs themselves, an assumption she had made within seconds of him sitting down across from her. Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. The particular frustration of watching a legitimate, well-documented claim treated as inherently suspicious because of an assumption that had nothing to do with the actual evidence in front of her. "This storm hit half the roofs on my street," he said, his voice level despite the mounting irritation. "I have photographs time-stamped the morning after, a contractor's written estimate, and I can give you the names of 3 neighbors who filed nearly identical claims this same week, all of which were processed without any additional scrutiny whatsoever. I'd like to understand what specifically about my documentation triggered this response, since it matches exactly what your own claims process requires." Priya did not have a specific answer. Only the accumulated weight of a judgment formed the moment she looked at his work clothes and decided, without asking a single respectful clarifying question, that additional scrutiny was warranted. Owen, sensing the shift in his father's tone, even though he did not fully understand the specifics, looked up from his book with the same watchful attention he brought to most uncertain situations. "Dad, is something wrong with the roof?" he asked quietly, more curious than alarmed, though the tension in the room was clearly registering with him regardless. Nathaniel glanced back at him, kept his voice warm despite everything else happening. "Just some paperwork, buddy," he said. "Give me a minute. Nothing for you to worry about." He turned back to Priya. "I'd like you to explain specifically what about my claim looks inconsistent," he said, "since I've provided exactly the documentation your process requires, and I'd like this resolved without unnecessary delay." A man, waiting in the small lobby, flipping through a folder of his own claim paperwork, had looked up entirely, watching the exchange with visible discomfort. An older woman near the entrance, waiting with her own folder of documents, had also paused, her attention drawn by the rising tension at the desk. A third person, a younger woman filling out a claims form at a nearby side table, glanced over as well, her pen pausing mid-signature as she took in the direction the conversation had taken. Priya, sensing the room's attention gathering, doubled down, rather than reconsidering. "I have to follow protocol when something looks unusual," she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "Then tell me specifically what protocol you're following," he said. "Don't just decide this is unusual because of how I'm dressed and hold up a legitimate claim that matches every neighbor's damage on my street." The man with the folder finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Priya directly. "I filed a claim for the exact same storm last week. Nobody questioned my photographs this closely. What's actually different here?" Priya glanced at him with visible irritation. "This isn't your claim," she said. The man did not back down. "I'm sitting here watching you delay a legitimate claim for no reason you've actually explained," he said. "That makes it my business." The older woman near the entrance added, more quietly but no less firmly, "For what it's worth, my roof took the same damage. Nobody sent an inspector to question whether my photos were real." The younger woman at the side table, still holding her pen, added her own observation, hesitant but audible. "He's got time-stamped photos and a contractor estimate," she said. "That's usually all this office asked for." Priya did not respond to any of them directly, her attention still fixed on Nathaniel, though the accumulating weight of a room full of witnesses, openly questioning her judgment, had visibly begun to erode her earlier confidence. It was at this point that another person in the waiting room, a man who had been sitting quietly with his own paperwork, stood and stepped closer, his attention shifting from his documents to Nathaniel's face with a growing intensity. That had nothing to do with insurance claims at all. He stopped a few feet away, staring, before finally speaking. "I know you," he said slowly, his voice carrying an uncertainty that made both Nathaniel and Priya turn toward him. Nathaniel looked at him, searching a face he did not immediately place among the many he had encountered over 12 years of service. "5 years ago," the man said, his voice steadying as recognition solidified. "My brother was wounded outside Kandahar, and the medevac that came for him had to fly through active ground fire to reach the extraction point. I was on the ground crew that day, and I remember watching that helicopter come in, low, taking hits, and not pulling out, staying on target until my brother and 2 other wounded guys were loaded and secure. I remember the specific sound the rounds made hitting the airframe, and thinking there was no way anyone would keep flying through that." Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest, an old memory surfacing, before he consciously reached for it. Fragments of tracer fire and radio static, and the specific narrow calculation required to hold a hover under fire long enough to complete an extraction. I remember the flight surgeon telling us afterward that another 2 minutes on the ground would have been the difference for my brother. The man continued, his voice unsteady now. "I never got the pilot's name. Different units, different channels, and I never had a way to track him down afterward, though I asked around for a while, back when the memory was still raw enough that I needed to know. I've told that story to my own family more times than I can count, about the pilot who held that position under fire until everyone was loaded, and I never thought I'd actually run into him at an insurance office, of all places, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that started out looking like nothing special at all. The office had gone almost completely quiet. Priya's hand, still resting on the photographs, had gone still. The man with the folder had set it down entirely, watching now, without any pretense of doing otherwise. The younger woman at the side table had stopped writing altogether, her pen hovering above her half-signed paperwork. Nathaniel stood very still, the weight of that mission settling back over him in a way he had not expected on an ordinary Tuesday morning claims appointment. "I remember that extraction," he said quietly. "Nathaniel Cole. Left active duty 3 years ago. That hover position wasn't exactly textbook, holding under that kind of fire, but it held, and it's one of the harder missions of my career to think about. Honestly, even 5 years later. The kind of memory that surfaces more often than I'd probably admit, if you asked me, directly." The man crossed the remaining distance and gripped Nathaniel's hand with both of his, holding it a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "My brother's home now, married, has a daughter of his own," he said, his voice rough. "None of that happens without those extra minutes you held that position. I never thought I'd get the chance to actually thank you, and I certainly never expected it would happen while you were being accused of insurance fraud over storm damage to your own roof." Priya sat behind her desk, with the particular stillness of a woman whose understanding of the last 20 minutes had just been completely restructured. She looked at Owen, still sitting quietly with his book, at the small crowd of people who had gathered near her desk, and something in her expression shifted from certainty into something considerably less comfortable. "I'd like this claim processed now," Nathaniel said, turning back to her, his voice still even despite everything. "And I'd like to understand why documented, time-stamped photographs matching a widely reported storm weren't sufficient before you decided this needed a fraud review." Priya, visibly rattled, mentioned something about routine caution, with unusually presented damage patterns. Nathaniel pointed out that his documentation matched exactly what several neighbors had submitted for the same storm without triggering any additional review, and asked what had actually made his situation different, since the storm itself had been extensively covered by local news and verified by the National Weather Service. Priya did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a decision made the moment she looked at his work, clothes, and decided, without asking a single respectful question, that suspicion was the appropriate response, rather than the same basic courtesy she had likely extended without hesitation to every other claimant who had come through that office that week. "I apologize," Priya said finally, the words arriving stiffly, a woman unaccustomed to producing them without an audience forcing the issue. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You should," he said. "Not because of anything you just heard about who I am, because you delayed a documented, legitimate claim and implied I'd fabricated evidence in front of my son before checking a single actual fact. That would have been wrong, no matter who was sitting across this desk." Priya nodded slowly, and something in her expression suggested the distinction had actually registered, even if it had taken an unlikely coincidence to make it land. Priya processed the claim within minutes once she finally reviewed the documentation properly, approving what should have taken 30 seconds from the very beginning. The entire delay resolved faster than it had taken her to first raise the fraud flag. The man who had recognized Nathaniel stayed nearby while the paperwork completed, crouching down slightly to speak with Owen, who'd been watching the entire exchange with wide, careful eyes. "Your dad's a hero. You know that," he said gently. Owen nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness he brought to most things. His book entirely forgotten now. "I knew he used to fly helicopters in the Air Force," he said. "I didn't know it was like that." The man smiled at him. "The bravest thing about your dad isn't just that day over Kandahar," he said. "It's that he came home and built a whole quiet life around taking care of you, and never once needed anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of strength, the kind most people never get to see because it doesn't happen anywhere anybody's watching." On the drive home, claim finally approved, Owen was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way he worked through most things, his book forgotten in his lap for once. "Dad," he said eventually, "why didn't you just tell her what you used to do right away? It would have stopped faster." Nathaniel glanced at him in the mirror. "Maybe," he said. "But then the lesson she'd have learned was that she was wrong to treat me that way because of what I did years ago, not because it was already wrong, before she knew anything about me at all. I want you to understand the difference, because only one of those is actually true." Owen considered this for a long moment, turning it over with the same seriousness he brought to most difficult ideas his father offered him. "So it's not about the helicopters," he said slowly. "It's about just treating people right, because they're people." Nathaniel nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Owen nodded back, satisfied, and then asked if they could get pizza to celebrate finally getting the roof fixed. An idea Nathaniel found himself unable to refuse, given how the morning had actually gone. He thought about that morning often in the days that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The insurance company's regional office called him personally later that week, an apology delivered without an audience this time, along with confirmation that adjusters would be receiving retraining on customer treatment and unconscious bias, delivered without Nathaniel needing to ask for either. The regional manager also mentioned that 2 other claimants had reached out separately in the days following the incident, describing what they had witnessed and requesting a broader review of how the office handled documented storm claims. Feedback Nathaniel suspected had done more to prompt the retraining than his own complaint alone would have accomplished. He accepted the apology without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture. The fact that his son had watched him hold his ground calmly in a moment designed to make him feel like a criminal over storm damage to his own house, had watched a stranger recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned without being told directly that dignity was not something earned by revealing what he had once done. Idiu was something owed simply for showing up as himself. Complete documentation and history both intact, asking for nothing more than the claim he had already legitimately earned. He thought, too, about the man from Kandahar, about the strange coincidence of an ordinary Tuesday morning containing both an unfair accusation and an overdue thank you that had been waiting 5 years for the right moment to finally arrive, and found something quietly moving in the fact that both had converged in the same 20 minutes, in an insurance office of all places, on a morning that was supposed to be about nothing more significant than a damaged roof. He also thought, driving home with Owen quietly reading in the passenger seat, about the particular symmetry of that morning, how the same composure that had once let him hold a hover position under fire had also carried him through an unfair accusation at a claims desk, and understood that whatever people assumed about him based on his work clothes, the actual measure of the man underneath had never changed, depending on who happened to be watching or what they happened to assume. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the fire he once held a hover position under, but the quiet, steady patience he brings home to the one child depending on him long after the missions have ended. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe now. There are more stories like this one coming.